Welcome back to the KDPG Sunday edition. I am joined by Jerry Miko of the Post-Gazette and Congressman Mike Doyle. Mike, we all still are reeling from October 27th here in Pittsburgh in our neighborhood of Squirrel Hill, the worst mass shooting in the city's history, horrified the nation. In response to that, City Council has been taking steps and proposing legislation to limit gun availability within city limits, and a new emphasis again on issues of gun control. First, how do you feel about the City Council's initiatives? You know, they've been challenged as overstepping their bounds as municipal government, and what steps does the Democratic Congress plan to take in terms of limiting gun access?
Well, I can certainly understand their frustration that tragedy after tragedy that has happened in this country, in Colorado, in Connecticut, where children were slaughtered, in Florida, all across the nation, and Congress has done absolutely nothing to address the situation in any meaningful way. So I think a lot of cities around America look at the inaction that has taken place in Congress over the years with regards to gun control and said, you know, if they won't do something, we're going to try to do something. So I understand that frustration, and I understand their desire to see some meaningful change. I will tell you that you will see legislation in the House of Representatives this year around sensible gun legislation. And I think, you know, one of the places that's going to start is on the issue of background checks. I think you're going to see some sort of a bill. You know, Senator Manchin and Senator Toomey had a bipartisan bill in the Senate. I think there's a deal to be made in the House and Senate on that. Many people like myself want to go much further. I favor banning military-style weapons for civilians. I see no civilian purpose in owning a gun like that. I don't know why anyone needs a rifle that can shoot 30 bullets. There's no civilian use for that. Why do we need bullets that can pierce Kevlar? There's no civilian use for that. So many of us would go much further, but I think practically speaking, a background check bill and some other things, closing loopholes around private sales, is something we should be able to get done.
On assault-type weapons, you don't even have unanimity within your own party. In fact, even
That's
in
true.
your own congressional caucus, Connor Lamb, recently elected, is not in favor of such a ban. So chances of that, you think, are still back burner? Well,
that's why I said in a pragmatic sense, I don't know that those are the bills that are going to go forward, but I do think we can get some agreement around background checks and closing some of these loopholes around private sales.
Mike, is it a type of thing when you have a Democratic House and a Republican Senate, and you've got a Republican president, you have a split government, and that's not unusual. We've seen that over the last few administrations, of taking more small steps to get pieces of legislation passed, and you're working now maybe more with the Senate to get it passed and not worrying so much about what the White House is doing, what the administration is doing. You mentioned gun control. You mentioned prescription drugs, infrastructure. Medicare for All is another thing that's going to come up, and that's a much bigger bill. But are there pieces of that, are there pieces of other things that people have talked about or legislation that are going to come up that maybe you see, we'll take a piece of it and try to move it forward?
Yeah, there actually are some hybrid approaches to the Medicare for All idea. One of it centers around people 50 and up. When you look at ACA, we said to insurance companies, you can't discriminate on people based on their health, pre-existing conditions. You can't cap their benefits. And we rate them by their ages. So the most expensive part of the ACA is people in that 50 and up range, and their premiums are rather high. There's talk about allowing people in that age group to opt into Medicare. This does two things. It will lower their premiums going into the Medicare system, and it takes some of the risk out of the risk pool because most of that tends to be with older people. So it helps the ACA risk pool at the same time. It helps people 50 and up. It would be sort of a movement in that direction. I think there's a lot of people that, while they may not totally back a Medicare for All system right now, that they could be persuaded to give this a try and see how that works.
What are your constituents' greatest concerns about health care?
The cost. Yeah. I mean, it used to be You know, if you had someone in your family with a chronic illness, with a cancer, the pre-existing condition clause was very important, and the capping of benefits. So that's why you saw that, you know, this last election was almost about pre-existing conditions with the healthcare debate. And that's because that's important to people, and everybody knows somebody in their circle of friends or in their family that has fallen victim to that.
It's a winning issue for the Democrats.
It's a winning issue, period, and they're not going backwards. You know, every Republican who voted against the ACA 62 times, which was the first bill ever to break ground with pre-existing conditions, are all now for pre-existing conditions. But the cost is still a factor, out-of-pocket costs. Employers are paying less of people's health care. People are being told, well, we'll pay this much, but you've got to pay out of your pocket for some of the premium. On top of that, you've got deductibles and co-pays. It's a problem.
What about costs to the taxpayer? Are Democrats running the risk of living up to their, you know, tax and spend image? If we're starting now, the presidential candidates are coming out talking about Medicare for all, and people are saying this is a budget buster. Mm-hmm. You know, we support the infrastructure bill. Now, some of you people on the left wing of you are calling for as much as a 70% tax on the ultra rich in America. Are people worried about, you know, what some would call sort of creeping socialism in the Democratic Party?
I think the Republicans have forfeited their ability to say that they're for balancing a budget. They gave $1.5 trillion away. They did not pay for it. The bulk of that money went to corporations and people at the top. Right. This middle class tax cut was a myth. It was illusionary. People know this now because they've not seen the money in their paycheck. And that is going to do more to raise the deficit over the next 10 years, $2 trillion once the interest is paid on that. So for Republicans to talk about tax and spend Democrats, when they gave away the largest amount of money in history to the people at the very top in corporations and didn't pay for it, and they know coming down the road, we're going to see this increase in the deficit.
But even as a given, if the Republicans have done that, you know, and they have increased the deficit and they haven't had found a way to pay for these tax cuts, can a Democratic Congress now move forward with all these new spending initiatives?
They didn't even try to pay for the tax cuts, okay? So it's not like they tried and couldn't find a way to do it. They just didn't do it. Mm-hmm. Democrats were never for bringing that top bracket down. This is why I mentioned that the Ways and Means Committee is going to start to look at some of this tax cut and say that maybe some of it should be reversed, that maybe the people at the very top bracket didn't need to go from 39.6 to 36%. That could be restored. The corporate net income tax was only supposed to come down 10% from 35 to 25. It's 21. Maybe that needs to be looked at. And you know what? The idea that you look at these marginal tax rates and say to people who make over $10 million, okay, that there's going to be a higher tax rate. I mean, back during the Reagan administration, taxes were that high at the top of the bracket. So
you support that?
This isn't something new. I think the idea that after a certain income, remember, it's not a 70% tax on the first 10 million. It's a 70% tax on that over 10 million.
On the second 10 million.
Exactly. There's a big difference.
Not going to affect us.
No, nobody here is going to be paying that tax.
Mike, I'm going to follow up just quickly on that, or at least talk about the party, your party, and in Congress. You took over the House, swept, as they call it, the wave coming in, the blue wave. But that brought a lot of new, fresh blood into the party. But it also brought, a lot of people think, a rather left-leaning, hard left-leaning approach. A lot of those folks said, you know, as a speaker, maybe Nancy Pelosi isn't the answer, and they were open about it, although, of course, she is the speaker now, and she's been the speaker before, a very powerful figure. But you're hearing a lot of different voices now, and a lot of people saying that, you know, maybe the party needs to do this, and you've got kind of a left wing, if you will, that's speaking its voice, and it's different, and they are maybe the new Democrats. This is similar to what the Republicans had maybe when they had the Tea Party folks come in, different ideology, but it's a subgroup of a party. They made a lot of trouble for John Boehner. And eventually Boehner just said, I'm tired of these guys. You think Nancy Pelosi's going to get to that point, or is the party going to change some? How do you see the new Democrats that have come in, and how will they change the party, or are they going to change the party?
Well, we had 62 or 63 new Democrats that came to Congress. Two things I'd say. The Democratic caucus looks a lot more like America now. We see a lot more women elected, people of color, people from different faith backgrounds. I think it's a real reflection of what we have in America. So I think that's a good thing. People are always uncomfortable with change sometimes, but I would say this, that when you think about the Tea Party, there's about 40 people voting as a block over there, and Boehner could only lose 21 votes. And oftentimes they gave him real headaches. That's not the case in the Democratic caucus. As far as Nancy Pelosi, it was a small group of people. It was 20 people out of a caucus of 230 that thought she shouldn't be Speaker. Well, they're all glad she's Speaker right now, and I've talked to all those 20 people that didn't vote for her. They think she's doing a pretty darn good job right now. So I think the idea that there's a problem in that caucus is not true, and there's not a block, by the way, of people in our party that are so swung, to the ideological left that it would cause any.
You don't believe that the
problems with it.
party's being pulled to the left?
No, we're a center-left party. I think the Democratic caucus is a center-left caucus. That's the vast majority, but we have it all. We have from blue dogs all the way down on to the other side, and everything in between.
Because of course the mantra has always been to win nationally, the party has to move to the center. That's how they're going to win nationally. But to win the House, it looks like they moved left. At least a lot of the people who came in were left. And I agree, it looks much more diverse now than it did before. And
redistricting has a lot to do with that. When you have districts that are more competitive, you tend to get more moderate candidates in those districts. Connor Lamb's a good example of, it was one of the swing seats. We have about 6 swing seats in Pennsylvania that are almost 50-50 seats, and I think you see the candidates coming out of those seats tend to be moderate Democrats or moderate Republicans. On the other hand, when you have a district that's 80 or 90% Republican or 80 or 90% Democrat, then the primaries, the base voters, are the ones that are dominant there, and you see those people a little bit more conservative or liberal.
Okay, well, a lot more to talk about, I guess. Some politics and some pressing issues. Join us back here with Jerry Miko and Congressman Mike Doyle after this break.